name's Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director here at the Ethics Centre, and I'd like to welcome you all to the conversation I'm going to be having with Teela Reid. Teela is a proud Wiradjuri and Wailwan woman, a lawyer, an essayist, a storyteller. She's co-founder of Blackfella Book Club, a platform that honours First Nations ancestors as the original, and I'd say the best storytellers. And currently Teela is a Sydney-based senior solicitor practising in Aboriginal land rights litigation and a practitioner in residence at the Sydney Law School. Would you please welcome her? We both want to acknowledge country in our own way, but before I do, some of you may know that I have kinship ties with the Anandaliakwa people up on Groote Island, and my totem is the stingray, and it's part of a story cycle that goes from the archipelago across to the mainland through Numbulwar and up to Yirrkala. And a very great man recently died, and so I've asked and received permission just to read some of his words to set the contexts for tonight. So these are the words of Yinapingu. He says, "This type of sacrifice for strength is the key to leadership. My father had to sacrifice much, too much, to reconcile his life with the ways of the modern world, but he did so. What Aboriginal people ask is that the modern world now makes the sacrifices necessary to give us a real future, to relax its grip on us, to let us breathe, to let us be free of the determined control exerted on us to make us like you. And you should take that a step further and recognise us for who we are and not who you want us to be. Let us be who we are, Aboriginal people in a modern world, and be proud of us. Acknowledge that we have survived the worst that the past had thrown at us, and we are here with our songs, our ceremonies, our land, our language, and our people, our full identity. What a gift this is that we can give to you if you choose to accept us in a meaningful way." We just pause and reflect on the spirit of generosity of what he recognised and what is offered to us all. We meet here today on Gadigal land. Gadigal are part of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, for their care for all that is seen and unseen within the land, the sea and the air, and to recognise their care for country, which is there for all of us. So on behalf of us all here, I acknowledge the elders and all the Gadigal people and any other Indigenous people, First Nations people who are here. And Teela, I think you also in your own way want to acknowledge this country.
Wiradjuri, Marang, Yinyangi, Yama, Yuindi, Teela, Nadu, Winang Nangai, Yinjamar, Marangay, May. Jirinya, Gadigabu, Nurumbangabu. Good evening everyone, I'm Teela. I pay my respects to the first peoples to be born to this country, and I acknowledge the Gadigal as the first peoples of this country.
Okay, we're going to talk about reckoning rather than reconciliation. Of course, we also have to talk about both, I guess. It's such an interesting word that you chose for your essay, because when I think of reckoning, three things come to mind. Firstly, there's a reckoning as in finding your bearings, dead reckoning. There's another sense in which you reckon up the bill. You know, you get, in fact, I think in South Africa, the bill's called the reckoning, and you add it all up and you have to pay. And then there's the third sense in which reckoning can be taken as a moment of recognition of one's responsibilities and making oneself confront the reality of who you are, where you are, what you've done and all the rest. So maybe if we can touch on all three of them, because I'm not sure if you had all of those three things in
Well,
mind.
if I'm being completely honest, that essay was, just make sure this is all right. That essay, Reckoning, Not Reconciliation, for me, when writing it, was really born out of a frustration with the concept of reconciliation. I had attempted to really dismiss it in some ways, whether that was to be provocative or just trying to grapple with my own sense of the world. For those millennials that are in here, we're all aging millennials now, but how entire 3, almost 4 decades has been defined in so-called Australia under this notion of reconciliation. And so for me, as a Wiradjuri Wailwan woman, the life that I have been fortunate to live, I would argue, had nothing to do with reconciliation, but it was in fact in spite of it. Because for me, having grown up in my community with the stories of my ancestors, my paternal and maternal lineages being hounded onto missions, laws passed so we couldn't speak our native tongue, and then there's this notion of reconciliation that kind of popped up. And I remember going to school. I quit Gilgandra public school, preschool. I walked home and I was like, I'm not going to preschool, I'll go back to public school. So I negotiated with my mum at that time that I promised I would go to primary school if I can do it on my terms. And so I just remember growing up in that community, and then walking in the school gates, and we were kind of trained that this notion of reconciliation was to make us feel good. And, you know, there was almost a sense of denial of the truth. Like I remember, for example, learning about the Anzacs, and there was no, you know, soldiers that we were told about that were Aboriginal men or women. And then I would walk home and my grandparents would sit me around the campfire. And I remember I was very fortunate, like I lived across the road from my grandparents. And so my granddad would always have a campfire going.
Is this Uncle Toot?
In the essay, yes, I speak about my pop Toot in the essay.
Yeah.
And I just remember just feeling really frustrated with the world. And for me, the notion of reckoning in that essay was really about, okay, reconciliation has tried to make us feel good, but we can all sense something's wrong here. And I wanted to kind of unravel that and unpack this notion of reckoning. And to me, that was about everyone on this continent actually embracing the discomfort of the hard work we need to get done. And so that was how that essay was really born, from a frustration of reconciliation.
Yeah. Tell me about your pop. It's called Pop Toot, I gather, because he used to like a smoke or something like that, is that right? And he'd have this fire like 365 days a week. What do you...
He would always have a campfire in my nan's garden. In the corner of the garden, he had his own portion of the garden. My nan would have her pond, and she'd come out and we would try and help her garden, but I didn't really have a green thumb. But I think there's over 50 grandkids now. I'm the eldest granddaughter in that maternal lineage. And so he would sit by the campfire every afternoon as the sun set. And it didn't really matter. Out west, once the sun sets, it's all a bit chilly anyway. So yeah, he'd just have it burning, and everyone that would travel through town, you know, some people would drop off wood or come in and get a cup of tea. I even remember Stan when I was much littler, like coming through town. And so yeah, I got a whole different education around that campfire, let's put it that way.
I get a sense he was a senior man out that part of the country, and people would, as a matter of respect as well.
An enormous amount of respect, yeah, for both my grandparents, and a lot of that history is up in Wailwan country in another different town called Galarganbone, where there is another mission out there that some of my lineage were on as well, and then kind of liberated themselves. But my granddad was the one who taught me about the importance of the matriarchal kinships. So although he had a lot of authority within my kinship, it was still an enormous amount of respect for the way in which women were the decision makers, the carers, the storytellers, the healers. And I'm not sure if it's that essay or my other essay on matriarchy, where I talk about my nan collecting the bush medicine, and so they had a beautiful relationship, yeah.
And I get the sense that that was an incredibly powerful formative experience for you.
And I didn't know then.
No.
Really, yeah.
So now here you are, a millennial.
Aging millennial.
An aging millennial. But you're also a lawyer.
Yeah.
And you're also a person who is clearly capable of forming and expressing independent perspectives on any topic, no doubt. How do you cope with, coping isn't the right thing. How do you look at the obligations you have within a structure where elders still are the most significant decision makers within a community, and yet at the same time working in a structure like the law, where it's about the quality of reason, the precision of language, the authority of precedent, lots of different things that aren't part of that world, because you're right in the middle of that.
Yeah. Yeah, the Western law is, you left the law as well. It's just it's a discipline. It's a practice. It is something I vividly recall being at law school, wanting to throw my textbooks up, against the library when we were learning about Dicey's rule of law and we're all equal before the law. And I was like, how do I reconcile this with the stories that I know? Clearly, the law has never treated my people fairly. There's never been a fair go in this country for First Nations peoples. And so having those stories kind of in my heart and in my spirit, I still took the opportunity that I was given to go to law school and now to practice law. That's still a result of the battles, I think, of my ancestors. And it's something I don't take lightly at all, because I think we as a peoples would be much worse off as a peoples if we were to take those opportunities for granted and not do the hard yards and actually live out those opportunities to empower our people. And I guess one of the experiences when I was in New York at the UN.
Yeah, this is the Permanent Forum for Rights of Indigenous People.
So being Australia's youth delegate there at one time, it just really occurred to me that this invasion, colonisation for all of us kind of sits along a spectrum. And it's often not until you leave the colony and reflect on Australia that you're actually really forced to turn a mirror up on this country and go, oh my God, the way in which our people are treated is on many levels inhumane. And it was that experience when I was a teacher that I was like, I do feel this sense of burning and a responsibility to go back to learn the white man's law and to also learn to play that game better than the white man.
So in a sense, you're going to, if you can, turn it to your advantage and use it in a way. But
it's a very difficult art. I mean,
well, you can lose something. You risk losing something of yourself in the process if you're not very careful.
Yes, and while I do wear the label of lawyer in this colony, I will first and foremost and always be Wiradjuri and Wailwan woman.
Yeah. Were you able to glean from that matrilineal group of older women the kinds of knowledge that you carry now onto another generation? Is that available to you still to learn and to apply?
I think it's an ongoing learning within our kinship. Like there are some
lifelong
things,
and compulsory.
Yeah, lifelong, compulsory. There's so much power, I feel like, as well, especially hanging around other titters from different nations, and you start to learn that there are different ways in which matriarchal kinships operate and function, and that there is so much power for us in the act of remembering those storylines, and so much power in owning the authority within those stories to be able to, when it is time to pass it down to the next generation, to do that and to help them understand their sense of place. And their sense of place isn't in these buildings or in a courtroom. It is on their country. When they, dig their little toes into the sand or the billa, the river. And that those are the ways in which you start to rebuild those connections with the next generation back on country. I mean, it's not lost on me either how fortunate now in hindsight I was to have that upbringing and also still have that connection to go back home to country.
Yeah. So the kind of compass in that first sense of reckoning for you, and I'm imposing a little bit more on your use of reckoning than you probably had in mind, is very much informed by two ways of things. And I get a sense that you think they can sit side by side in a way that it's not going to destroy you. You're not going to be forced to be one thing or the other, that you can keep them together? Or is that a very big tension in your life?
It's a constant tension, to be very frank. It is a very constant tension to not lose yourself as a First Nations woman in this place that's now called Australia. And you're constantly walking a fine line. And when I think about reckoning as well, it's not just the kind of in spite of reconciliation, it's about power. It's about who has the authority to make decisions in different contexts. While at the community level, our governance systems operate in a very specific way. And I think that's what Australia forgets. Like, we actually have very ancient governance systems here, still very much intact. They might not be written in legislation or, rule books or any book, but they're passed down orally through our ways of knowing and being. And so I know you've split in your mind reckoning into kind of perhaps three pillars, but the other way I tried to think about it was we have this higher order in Australia where, there's parliament, there's states, there's territories, there's this, there's people making all these different decisions. But at the very heart of that, there is still the omission of the First Nations, and there's still an act of erasure in that. And the symbols are everywhere. It's in the flag, it's in the anthem, it's in these ways that Australians speak their identity that I just don't relate to.
I wrote a piece in The Australian which made the case for the pre-existing nations that were here prior to colonisation. Got a lot of very nasty comments, hundreds and hundreds of them, for having mentioned that. But that's the truth. And of course the other thing about it is, and I think this is part of the complexity that people sometimes struggle to deal with, is that all authority is ultimately local. It's a group of people who speak for their country, and to try and say that it can all be diffused over kind of national bodies or other bodies simply doesn't happen in that tradition.
Perhaps a better way to try and explain an example is going through the pandemic and the way in which decisions were made about communities on who might get the vaccine or who should be more protected kind of within communities. What we saw across Western New South Wales was that there was a complete lack of recognition from both, state decision makers and federal decision makers about prioritising Indigenous communities. And I think that speaks to a bigger problem we have in the country, which is unless you fit a stereotype of what a First Nations person is, then you actually don't get a seat at the table or any kind of say in these big decisions, which the consequence of that was very real for us in Western New South Wales. The first Aboriginal person to die from COVID-19 was in Dubbo. The failure to identify First Nations communities here in this jurisdiction meant that, you know, communities like Wilcannia in far western New South Wales almost were threatened getting wiped out. And that was on the back of both the borders being open here, and then also, you know, I think there were barely any First Nations decision makers at the table when it came to how do we prioritise those communities in this national, you know, this national kind of emergency response.
So we talked a bit about how you orient yourself towards this problem. Let's now look at the notion of adding up, and we'll put the two almost together, the reckoning in the sense that you had. The concept of Makarrata, as traditionally, is that close to what you think reckoning should be?
I don't want to misinterpret what the Yolngu people might have meant by Makarrata, but the way in which it's expressed within the mandate of something like the Uluru Statement is it's a call for peace. It's a call to end the struggle. And it's an invitation. Do Australians want to stop? You know, this kind of ongoing war and battle.
So the only word for it also was a genuine reckoning with what had happened, which involved restitution.
Yeah.
So the concept of payback is sometimes misunderstood as if it's revenge. It's actually the person who has done wrong paying back to balance things through that. I'm just going to read another bit that comes from Yunupingu just on this question of it. It might give a sense of it. He says, it was my father, perhaps for the last time before the missionaries arrived, who had the responsibility to make this happen in a proper way. That is, there'd been a series of really bad fighting between various clans up in that neck of the woods. To do it in a proper way, in a proper Yolngu way, to bring about reconciliation. After the Makarrata, that is the process that was used, my father was widely praised by the senior leadership throughout East Arnhem Land. So the quest for peace and harmony in the world wasn't anything new to Yolngu when the missionaries came and spoke of such ideals. They were already our words and our way of life. We had seen it through the actions of my father who performed these duties in his time. And we still think in this way when we think about our future. How do we reconcile? What do we need to give? And what must be given to us for our loss, for our grievance? How do we balance the wrongs that have been done with a need to work together in the future? So Makarrata was rarely, if ever, a painless process. It often involved a spear in the thigh, actually, and things like that. But it was a wholeness that came about because of the recognition on both sides. So is that the kind of reckoning that you have in mind, that it brings to that point where people recognise loss and it's a give and take?
What I have in mind is very different to probably what is also expressed, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, let's unpack what you actually had in mind.
So, you know, the way in which you have kind of articulated with those words, it is about the reconciling of the balance. You know, there does need to be reparations here. There does need to be compensation. There does need to be these tough, I think, decisions and reparations for what First Nations peoples have lost. That's undeniable, I think, in relation to that. The other way in which I would personally see it, it's that while you say, you know, there is a level of discomfort, I think it comes down to kind of this truth-telling notion for us that we're going to need to embrace, each and every one of us sitting here. And I think Australians probably don't realise yet, like, where we're at now, each one of you are advocates, you're campaigners. You actually have to take you have agency in this movement. And the way in which I see this notion of reckoning in my mind, it's that this is going to be a really difficult process. Unlike reconciliation, where we've all felt good with our wraps and our cupcakes and our teas, no, like this is going to be quite difficult. And for so long, for 250 plus years, as a nation, we've avoided that discomfort that comes with trying to heal these wounds. Because, you know, you might not see the physical wounds, but they're very deep and they're intergenerational. And what I probably need to write a new essay on this, kind of think about when I think of this, it's that when we think of reckoning, we're all going to have to step up to the plate. And when it comes to truth-telling, often what happens in a truth-telling process, it's that, you know, First Nations peoples get the onus of having to speak our truth. When in fact, I actually think white Australia needs to speak its truth. What did your ancestors do to my ancestors? And actually start to have an open dialogue and take responsibility for that pain. Because I don't think that we can heal until we actually reckon with the discomfort and the pain that I think as a nation is going to take many years to get through after this year.
And we're going to have to care for ourselves enough to be able to do this, because anything difficult of that kind, it requires honesty, but it also requires a care for oneself too.
Yeah.
So that you can bear the truth in this particular case. And I suspect that the wounds that have flown from that colonial period fall on both sides. I know somebody I respect very, very highly, Marcia Langton, has talked about this whispering in the ear about the illegitimacy of occupation and the damage it does to those who constantly doubt the legitimacy of their own position. And partly I think what could come from what you've described is, despite the initial discomfort of it, of staring at it, is the great relief of being almost welcomed home. You know, these wandering people who've been sort of scratching across the surface of the continent can finally be at home in the truth and be accepted, and that's the hand that is there. So this brings us to, I suppose, the moment you refer to, which is the proposed referendum. This is going to be an extraordinary moment, one way or another, for us. What are your hopes? What are your hopes for the process of the referendum at this point?
I hope that people are willing to step up and be engaged and make informed choices for themselves in a conversation that should absolutely be based on the facts, and not one in which I think we should be enlivening racism or anything like that. I believe that, I do believe it'll pass. I think there is so much goodwill in the Australian community. If you look at history, 1967, the most successful referendum, Australians actually feel very deeply on this issue. I've travelled to lots of different parts of the country, and not just to groups like this that are already kind of engaged in the conversation, but you know, more fence sitters or people who actually want to rock up and protest to these kinds of conversations. By the end of it, you sit down, you listen, you work through these conversations, and people's hearts really get it. I believe that with this year, I don't know, I think it's going to be difficult. It already has been. I've had to take some time off my social media, for example, because when you...
Being trolled by people?
Yeah, the trolling, or just the way in which news gets, goes through my feed. I just don't want I try and switch off to save my spirit the trauma.
It must be hard that if everyone attends to every word, that it's possible that, you know, you can be in one moment and the slightest slip of a pause even can be interpreted, misinterpreted, reinterpreted, and things like that. And yet I imagine you can't sit back and not be involved in the conversation about a proposal may not be perfect, but it's probably going to be better than anything else.
In moments like that, when I do feel that, I remember something my nan said to me when we were losing lots of people in our community, people very close to me. And she sat me down and she said, God would never gamble with more than you can handle. And I just think, while the heaviness can be there, especially I think carrying the weight and responsibility of community, or even the professional responsibility can be a lot sometimes. It's just taking the time out to understand that it's okay to step away and replenish the spirit, but there is nothing that comes at me that I can't handle.
So we were talking a bit before about and this is the two parts of your life, the lawyer, which is very attentive to specific words and language.
Yes.
And then there's the spirit of these things, what's intended, the opportunity for the reckoning that you describe. This seems to be a moment where there are lots of people focusing, and I understand why they do, on the very precise question of words and this and that. But am I right in thinking that you believe that, for the reasons you described before, that the spirit of what's intended, even if it's not a conclusion, it's an imperfect beginning, it is nonetheless a beginning of a new set of possibilities in this country?
I do believe, yes, it is. There are two parts to kind of what you've said. One, the spirit, the other is my lawyer trait of hinging on words. And I mean, we all know the Uluru Statement has called for a First Nations voice, and that one of the things I am grappling with, both in the legal sense and the moral sense, it's the enormous compromise our people have to make decade after decade after decade for this nation to just have a breakthrough here and there. And I just feel like it happened with land rights. You know, the Barunga Statement was gifted to Hawke. Hawke promised a treaty, he gave the nation reconciliation. It's probably why we're 3-4 decades behind right now. And I don't think that prime ministers like Hawke should be revered for what they've done. You know, and even around when Whitlam came in for his short time in power, there were decades of activism and movements that were demanding big things, big changes. And it was only because of that activism that within those 3-4 years, there was able to be this, you know, watershed moment of legislation and changes. And so here I am thinking now, okay, there's another compromise being made. We're having an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice and of the First Peoples of Australia. And perhaps this is more my moment of having to grapple with the way in which compromises are made in the political space. It doesn't change who I am as a Wiradjuri and Wailwan woman, but I certainly think as part of this process, and back to your previous question as well, I hope that everyday Australians are able to take this opportunity this year to actually reflect and educate themselves on the bigger picture and the bigger part of the story to this, because we're only really seeing it through that one little kind of myopic lens now, that there's going to be one ballot box and you're going to be voting yes or no, but there is so much more to this.
I think what's really interesting about what you said too is whether or not the community recognises that this is a compromise.
Yes.
That if people could just say, actually, if you asked Indigenous people in Australia, First Nations people, to say, what did you really, really want in an ideal world? It would be something more. But this is a sacrifice, a bit like Pingo was talking about with his father. He's willing to compromise to make things better. And so I suppose that adds to the generosity of the offer, I suppose, which we're all hoping people will take up.
Yeah.
And you're optimistic about that. You think that people will get it, that the goodness in their heart towards this and ending this question of legitimacy and all the other things that go with it can be done, will be done.
I do believe it'll pass,
Yeah.
yes. I think there's so much good faith and goodwill in the people. The strategy behind this movement is correct. Going to the people and not the politicians is actually what changed this nation. Each and every one of you guys, seriously. When there were 2 prime ministers in the past who dismissed it, one said to me on Q&A to my face, it's going to go up in flames. That was Turnbull. ScoMo just kicked the can down the road. At every single turning point, the only reason it's on the national agenda is because of everyday Australians. It won't be easy. I think that people shouldn't get complacent about where we are now, between now and the ballot box. Every single one of you is going to have to start your own campaign, take this extremely seriously. Like, for someone like me, it doesn't stop. This is 24/7 work. It's also spiritually demanding. Like, there are some days where I wake up and I can feel my ancestors so heavy that I can't produce the loyal work,
When you say that, what, they're heavy in the sense of urging you on, or?
Well, sometimes they just stop me in my tracks.
To think?
To slow down, to think, to not just react.
Yeah.
To talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if Australians actually really do realise that. Our ancestors are everywhere for us, and it's been a really lovely thing to have lots of different titters like Narelda and from around the country, being able to sit down and have cuppas and embrace this moment, because there is a real big sense of heaviness for all of us right now. I would say our community are going through. It's certainly not a feel-good process. I know it's been pitched by the politicians that this will make Australians feel better, but in fact, this is very difficult spiritual work for us on a lot of different and moral. We're having conversations that perhaps would not normally be in the public domain, that are now, if people are sharing them on social media, they're gonna see it all play out there as well.
Yeah.
But
are you going to stay away from social media now because of that, or do you think it's a tool that you can use to influence people?
I think it's a tool I can use at different times.
Right.
It's just not going to absorb me.
It's interesting about the ancestors. I do think you're right that many people don't realise that the concept of past, present and future is all enfolded in the song cycles, and there isn't a group. And that's why when people, I don't know what the practice is out your way, but certainly up on Groot, if you go into another bit of country, you stop and you call out. And you yell out to them and say, here we are, we're just coming in, we're going to do such and such. And it's not just a ritual, it's actually calling out to people who are there, and the ancestors who are still living. So if you're feeling them at this moment, is that more now than you felt them before? Is this something about what's happening, you think, bringing them to the fore in different ways?
It's funny because with my job, I don't normally talk about this side of me, but this is an interesting conversation because it's bringing out all the different layers of the person I am. But they've always been there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think they're always there to answer the difficult questions. So, yeah.
And to hold you.
Yeah.
Yeah. What we're going to do is, I reckon we've got a room full of people who are going to have questions for you, probably far better questions than I've been able to ask. And there are people online too. So can I invite you, whether you're online or in the room, if you've got some questions, you can type them in in whatever the chat box is, I'm sure, there. But if you're in the room also, we'll bring a microphone to you so that the people online can hear your question as you ask it. Try and make it a question rather than a speech of your own. If you can resist that temptation, that'd be great. So has anybody got a question for Teela? Yeah, there's a gentleman down here. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Lindsay Kelly. Thank you for coming on. The representation of First Nations people in Australia is about 3.3% of our overall population. In the most senior political body in this country, being the Federal Senate, there's a representation of about 10.5% of First Nations people sitting in that chamber. Why is that not a voice?
Thank you for your question. There are a couple of responses to that. The first would be that people in Parliament represent their political parties. They do not represent the interests of First Nations peoples. If I'm being very frank and honest, they represent Liberals, Nationals, Labor, Greens. So that's the starting point. And I think an example of one of the dilemmas recently is seeing Lydia Thorpe walk out of the Greens party because she felt like she couldn't represent her constituency. So that's one example. But I think the other one as well is that it's not just a numbers crunching game. I mean, if you look at the jurisdiction of Tasmania, for example, it has, I think, 12 senators for the one of this. So at the end of the day, when it comes to the First Nations voice and the conversations that I was involved in the process leading up to it, people wanted a voice that was able to speak to their community issues. And sometimes that might not even be an issue that Labor or Liberal are prioritising. Sometimes it might be, one of the examples was they wanted a voice to be able to also speak the truth, and that their idea of the truth-telling stuff was around not in a royal commission sense, like in an enormous process like that, but they wanted things around the trees or where there's sites, like the massacre sites on country, or having this localised voice to be able to speak to what was happening in their communities. So the concept of the First Nations voice is really to represent the interests of First Nations peoples.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, down the front here. Please let me know if there's anyone with any questions online. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Teela. I'm like you. I'm feeling very optimistic that the yes vote will get up, particularly because we have a Prime Minister and a government who is supporting it, and history shows that the 8 out of the 44 referendums that have got up, it's the Prime Ministers that have supported it that have been successful. I just wanted to ask you, a lot of the people with the no vote say we should be focusing on closing the gap instead of a voice to Parliament. What do you say to them? I mean, can you say that my understanding is that a voice to Parliament will support closing the gap? What do you have to say to those people, that it should be that instead of that? It's not really an either or. Yeah.
Thank you. It's interesting because some of the people who are saying those comments come within the coalition, or, politicians themselves who have proven that they cannot close the gap. And so the idea really is that actually First Nations people want agency in this. They want to be able to determine and dictate how the gap should be closed, and on a practical level. And while I think I should say that is one argument for the voice, it's not the only one. Lots of people as well in the I remember, one of the elders that took me under his wing was Uncle Sol Belair, the late Uncle Sol Belair, and they didn't just speak about the voice having to fix the problems colonisation caused us. Because the gap is a result of colonisation. But it shouldn't have to just be the role of the voice to fix those problems the colony caused. So lots of people actually spoke about, and elders in particular, were, I wish, you know, some of it was recorded. It was so generous in its offer. If it was me, I would be not as generous as some of our elders that were like, we want Australians to know our songlines and our stories and what it means to belong here in this land, in this place. I mean, so lots of different layers to why the voice had become the priority. One of them was close the gap, but not the only one. And I think when this does pass, we will see the many different First Nations communities step up, and I believe they will live out their offer to this nation in a way that you could only really wonder in respect of the generosity that some of our old people gifted, because even in light of that brutality that they experienced, and some of these are like stolen generations, we're still so willing to sit down and build a table with people who had caused them so much heartache. So it's going to be an interesting time, I think.
I just want to speak to what Teela's been saying through direct personal experience. I mean, that is about as white a skin as you can hope to find. And yet I, because of how I was taken in and accepted both ways, have as close a family relationship with the mob up on group as you could ever hope to know. And sometimes I find it hard to believe. Stan Grant, who's in the audience, was with me when we were in a place at the end of last year where bumped into a wonderful ceremonial senior ceremony guy from Numbulwar who recognised me immediately as his uncle under the kinship title. Now, you might say, oh yeah, that's fine, make it up, but all I can tell you, it doesn't matter who you are, when you got here, where you came from, if you take that hand, you'll belong, and that's the generosity. Despite all the terrible things that will happen. So the possibility of this is real. It's not a thing created for a rhetorical point. It is a genuine offer that every single Australian could have. All you've got to do is to say yes, to accept it, to belong. There's a question online, I think, at least one, and Seth Hardy is going to relay that question to you.
There's quite a few questions coming through, but we're going to give you Jacqueline, who said, do you think the voice should be somewhat more binding of Parliament, or is that not possible?
More binding. I'll try and answer that. The whole point of a constitution is to separate power. That's just a fact. It's there to legislate, executive, judiciary. And those are all checks and balances on each other. So, you know, if someone is to get to the High Court with a matter, then the High Court tests the boundaries of that issue. If you insert a First Nations voice within that document, it is going to be part of that check and balance. So that's how I would say it is binding. In a sense, once it's there, the issue is it's mandated by the people of Australia. It cannot be undone. And that the public pressure that this referendum being successful will put on Parliament and the executive to listen to the First Nations voices, it will be powerful. I have no doubt about that. And one thing that we haven't tried is for the people of Australia to pass this by a double majority. While we have had voices in the past, something like ATSIC or NAC or FCATSIA, those are all kind of legislative kind of bodies put up because either a Prime Minister wanted it there or Parliament wanted it there, but they were able to take it away. There was nothing really secure or binding about that apart from the political will. This will now be a mechanism post a successful referendum in which it cannot be taken away, and the legitimacy of that First Nations voice will be forever part of the Australian democracy.
Thank you. Sess, is there another person you'd like to, and then we'll come down, we'll get one more online and then we'll come to the person at the front.
We've got Kay who's changing her question as we speak. So it must be that you're actively influencing her, Teela. It's there. It's there, but I think she's softening her language. She's getting fired up. Kay would like to know Teela's thoughts on the group or groups of Aboriginal people who are against the voice.
Oh, that's a very blunt question.
Oh, yeah. Is that it?
Yeah, so she's on a roller coaster.
I think if we unpack some of the reasons people are dissenting on the issue, the reasons are actually arguments for a voice. People are feeling silenced. People are feeling as though they want a fairer go in the democracy and the process and everyday life. Clearly, some of those people, including my own, have been let down in the past by these political processes. And I would say that this will be a political voice. People are totally entitled to debate and disagree, and that shouldn't be fear to vote no at a referendum. In fact, that should be more reason why we can create a better and more robust democratic process if we're able to listen to the diversity of First Nations voices. Because what we haven't really embraced either is the fact that there are so many different First Nations voices. I mean, we've got to wake up every day and we listen to white politicians argue yes and no, and it's like no one's asking for them to be abolished or dismantled, but that's just debate.
Oh, a few people are.
Some people are. But no, I think that those voices are as important, and in some instances are still an argument for a voice.
So we have a question down the front, please, Sess.
Actually, that was my question.
Oh. Okay, over there, please. Just and someone at the back, you'll be next.
Hi, Teela. Thank you. My question is, I agree with you that reckoning is a really important aspect, and I suspect that the effectiveness of the voice in terms of the buy-in from politicians will be contingent upon that reckoning process in terms of how much White Australia takes on board the reckoning that needs to happen. And so my question is, if you could design the mechanisms for how that reckoning would occur, what would you like to see?
So we know that there will be a process prior to a referendum. Let's think about what we know. We know there's going to be a process prior to a referendum and a process after a referendum. What the reckoning looks like after will totally be based on the self-determination of those First Nations and not me as an individual. I think that there are different ways in which people are starting to reckon with what's happened here on this continent, whether they embrace the truth-telling part of it. What we know is that you actually do need something to compel Parliament and Executive to actually sit down, listen, shut up, pay the rent. And they're not going to do that alone. They're not just going to come at their own free will. And so what we actually need is everyday Australians to first get this across the line and not be afraid of what's going to come. It's not going to be anything fearful. I mean, my kind of argument for the reckoning is more about this healing, this peace, this coming together. Like, I want this to end. And actually so many of our elders did as well. When you think about, we're almost 3-4 generations, I think, into invasion, it means a lot of our old people are quite old or now, onto their last breaths. And I'm not exaggerating that at all. So when we think of the reckoning in that sense, don't just think about kind of in monetary sense, but thinking about it in like, who are we? Like, are we going to deny these voices still, or are we actually going to start to embrace some of the truth telling here that comes with it? And that reckoning just comes with you grappling with your own discomfort and being honest. Because I also do wonder if white Australia is ready to be honest.
Look, the truth I'd say is it's really mixed. I think there are some people who say, what's the fuss? Isn't everything all fine? There are some people who are content not to look, because if you look, you must then see.
Yeah.
And there are some that are ready. But I think once the change starts, if the referendum can be successful, even if it's imperfect, what it's going to do, it's going to release a process which I think will gather momentum.
And this is why the actual referendum is key to this reckoning. I think because we've had royal commissions, we've had coronial inquests, we have inquiry after inquiry, report after report, recommendation after recommendation. And it's already all written there. It's just that there's no accountability when nothing's implemented or nothing's taken up. And so I think that will be a key difference, is the public pressure to be able to speak.
It's our constitution together that we make. I'm going to apologise to the person at the back. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but you might grab Teela when we finish with the question, because we need to bring this conversation to end. I'd ask you to keep an eye out in the future, if you like this sort of conversation, this series. The ethics of ownership and the ethics of inhibition are two further events that we've got coming up. All of the Ethics Centre staff and supporters I'd like to thank as well. And of course, I'd encourage anyone who's in the room to use the Vox box just out there to write your questions and thoughts. But last and not least, as we wind up, would you please join with me in thanking Teela Reid.